Okay, close reading starting on page 323. We're about a third of the way down. The paragraph begins the process in question, here known as Verwerfung, which I do not believe has ever been commented on in a sustained manner in the analytic literature, is situated very precisely in one of the moments that Professor Hyppolite has just brought out for us in the dialectic of Verneinung. Verwerfung is exactly what opposes the primal Bejahung and constitutes as such what is expelled. We were just talking about this. You will see proof of this in a sign whose obviousness will surprise you, for it is here that we find ourselves at the point at which I left you last week, a point beyond which it will be much easier for us to go after what we have just learned from Professor Hyppolite's talk. I will thus forge ahead. Lacan continues. And the most fervent devotees of the idea of development, if there are any here, will be unable to object to the phenomenon that occurred at too late a date to constitute a primal scene, since Professor Hyppolite has admirably shown you that it is mythically speaking that Freud describes this Bejahung, as primal. And again, we know what he means here by mythical. He's not talking about Genesis, but origin. Not where things started, but where it appears things began looking back at one's past. A mythical or original moment, not a genetic one. Verwerfung thus cut short any manifestation of the symbolic order. That is, it cut short the Bejahung, that Freud posits as the primary procedure in which the judgment of attribution finds its root. Now, what he means here by attribution is secondary to what Freud means by existence. A judgment of existence is to acknowledge whether something exists. So, is the building on fire? Yes or no? That's a judgment of Bejahung, according to Freud, because you're judging whether whether a fire in that building exists. Later, once you have affirmed that there is a fire in that building, then you can raise a question. Are the attributes of this fire dangerous? Should I be concerned? Should I call 911? Technically speaking, when I cook dinner and the oven is on, there's a fire in that house. I affirm the existence of a fire in that house. I can then go on to say, are the attributes of that fire dangerous? The answer is no. If, however, the building is in flames, reaching up into the sky, obviously I'm going to say the attributions of that fire are dangerous. But first, again, I have to have this primitive moment of affirmation that a fire even exists. That is a judgment of existence, Freud says. That's what he means by Bejahung. And what Lacan wants to do is take that judgment of Bejahung and apply it to the symbolic, to the advent of language, the origin of which is castration. The name of the Father, the know of the Father. That's where Lacan wants to attach Bejahung, is to the symbolic order and its founding. Excellent stuff on page 323 towards the bottom. We are moving quicker than that, though. Top of 324. Lacan returns to this quote from Freud about the patient who did not want to know anything about it, namely castration, in the sense of repression. That passage means a lot to Lacan. Here, notice where he goes with it. 4 lines down on 324. For in order for him to be able to know something about his castration in this sense, it would have had to come in some way to light in the primordial symbolization. But once again, what becomes of it? You can see what becomes of it. And then here's the key point, italicized. What did not come to light in the symbolic appears in the real. Now, this is a kind of misleading passage. What should be said here, technically speaking, it should be said that what did not come to light in the symbolic appears in and as the real. This is how we get the real. The real as a category in Lacanian psychoanalysis does not precede the symbolic. On the contrary, the real is whatever is left of the swimming here and now world in which things, if they aren't even things, are confusing, lizards and rocks, blah. You see how we just are getting way before language or anything like that. This primordial state of being before language is not the real. The real are among other things, it is comprised of the parts of that original here and now, fluid, infantile, bioanimalistic existence that can't be fit into the symbolic. It's whatever the symbolic can't metabolize, account for, and represent. That's what becomes the real. The real is what gets excised, left unsaid in the symbolic. It's what gets kicked out, if you will. But even the in and out here doesn't quite work, because the real is really a rip or a tear or some aspect of the symbolic where the symbolic can't quite shine its light. That happens in the symbolic. It's a blind spot, a dark spot in the symbolic, not some external world. And if you want to be very technical about it, you might even say that those dark spots in the symbolic are precisely what legitimate it. Precisely the dark spots that allow the symbolic to operate. The symbolic needs those dark spots in order to function. We've got lectures on that elsewhere, so I won't go into it too much here. For that is how we must understand. And then we've got another German phrase here, meaning taking into the subject, and another German phrase taken from Freud's essay, meaning expelling from the subject. What gets expelled is what constitutes the real. And notice how Lacan puts it here. The latter constitutes the real, insofar as it is the domain from which subsists outside of symbolization. Now again, that outside is misleading here. It's an outside that exists within the symbolic order. And that's one of the hooks here to understand about how the real operates. It doesn't precede the symbolic, nor does it exceed the symbolic. It exists within the symbolic. Exists. It's not even actually an existent entity. That's its dilemma. This is why castration, which is excised by the subject here from the very limits of what is possible, but what is also thereby withdrawn from the possibilities of speech, appears in the real, erratically. Erratically is a great choice of word here. The real wanders through the symbolic as error, as erratic. In other words, it appears in relations of resistance without transference. To extend the metaphor I used earlier, I would say like a punctuation without a text. Very interesting. I love these metaphors, they're terrific. He goes on to talk a little bit about the real, again emphasizing that the real is something outside the subject that is expelled. And then noticed on the bottom of 324, the real gets an even more crystalline definition. 4 lines up from the bottom. The real, namely that which is excised from the primordial symbolization. Excised from the Latin ex scimere, same scimere word for scissors, cut out. But it's not a cut out that is then cast aside beyond the symbolic. It's an area of the symbolic where if you were looking at it like a fabric, a cutout would appear. A hole would emerge within the fabric itself. It's not something that's cut out and thrown aside. It is a cutout from within the fabric. This is the best way to understand the real. And 324 does a really good job of explaining this. He then gets into a discussion of hallucinations, which continues for a while. and is pretty useful. There's some good stuff on déjà vu in there as well on page 326. But that key passage for us on 323 to 324 is where I would really recommend focusing your attention. And one of the great takeaways here, as we've discussed, is how the real operates, how the real is generated, engendered by the symbolic. So even in this primitive moment of Bejahung, you're going to have certain parts of lived experience that get excised, where the light of the symbolic does not reach. The difference, though, between a neurotic and a psychotic subject, according to Lacan, is that the neurotic accepts that there is this thing that gets constituted by the symbolic at its outer reaches, an internal blind spot known as the real. The psychotic doesn't even get that far. They reject the primitive affirmation, the Bejahung, that would necessarily be in place for anybody to accept that there could be blind spots in there. The great blind spot in me, of course, is the unconscious, which is where I shove all the repressed signifiers from my life. Human beings live in a field of blind spots. We have so many just within ourselves. Don't forget, that's the primary stake here. Normal people repress, pushing signifiers into the unconscious. The psychotic expels signifiers from the unconscious, if they even interact with signifiers at all. For normal, and here I don't mean happy or content, I just mean what's average. The average person, the usual people, with some neurotic symptoms, which is also quite normal, or is as close to normal as I think Lacan would say you can get, are people who endure repression. In order to endure repression, you first have to have an experience of negation. So let's go back to that example one more time of I'm not a liar. There are times when I've told lies, you might think to yourself. And I don't want to think about those times, because I don't believe that's the kind of person I am. You might say things like, oh, everybody makes mistakes. And one of which was when I lied here, there, or the other. Oh, everybody just makes mistakes. You don't want to think about that. You don't want to have that in your mind. You don't want to think about all the times that you've lied, because that doesn't comport with your sense of self, with your ego that believes it's not a liar. So you repress those memories of the times you told lies. But in order to repress those times and those memories, you have to first at some level negate them, deny them. But in order to negate or deny them, you have to first affirm their existence. So that again is the logic we're working with here. For repression to occur, negation has to first occurred. And in order for negation to occur, an affirmation has to have occurred before that. You can't repress that which hasn't already endured this process of negation, which implies a primitive affirmation. This is one of the reasons why, just because it's out of sight and out of mind, doesn't mean that it's not going to pop back up into your perceptual field later. Why the return of the repressed is always the flip side of the coin of repression. In part because the very structure and mechanism known as repression has this dialectic built into it of affirmation and negation, acceptance and denial, Bejahung and Verneinung, that are being wrapped up in ways that simultaneously index an experience or an event or an entity and cancel it. Yet another reason why we're looking at Jean Hyppolite here. Hyppolite is a great commentator on Hegel, and one of the great comments on Hegel that Hyppolite makes the most of is Hegel's use of the term Aufhebung, which is a German term meaning to preserve and to cancel at the same time. Isn't that exactly what repression does? It is a cancellation and a preservation of some part of ourselves that we don't want to think about. That's one of the central stakes in this little trio of writings by Freud, Lacan, Hyppolite. More soon.